Imagine trusting someone with your child's safety, only to discover they were the threat all along. For the Carter family, this nightmare came true when a school bus driver turned their new neighborhood into a battleground. What unfolded next was a fight not just for their daughter's safety, but for justice in a system that seemed designed to look the other way. Curious to find out how they turned the tables? Keep watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more stories like this. It's funny how a mother's instinct can pick up on the smallest things that others might miss. Julia Carter wasn't one to overreact, but something about Mr. Thompson, Emily's school bus driver, gnawed at her. Maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or how he seemed to watch Emily a little too closely. "Mom, he's just nice," Emily would say, dismissing her mother's worries with the naivety only a child could possess. But Julia knew better. There was something more behind those friendly gestures. One chilly morning, as Julia sent Emily off to school, her gut screamed louder than usual. That same nagging feeling. Her mind replayed every brief interaction with Mr. Thompson, each one feeling more unsettling than the last. It's like when you're watching a suspense movie and the music starts building up. Except this wasn't a movie. Julia tried shaking off the paranoia, but it stuck with her, lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake. After all, it's said that a mother knows best, right? Maybe I'm being overprotective, Julia muttered to herself. But that didn't stop her from lingering at the bus stop a little longer the next day. Mr. Thompson glanced her way, that eerie smile still plastered on his face, and something clicked inside Julia. The warmth of motherly love turned into a fire of suspicion, urging her to keep a closer eye. She didn't realize it yet, but this small feeling would soon grow into a storm of revelations, one that could change everything. Moving to a new place is hard enough, but for the Carter family, it felt like stepping into another world, one that wasn't exactly welcoming. Being one of the only Black families in the neighborhood came with its own set of challenges. Julia and Marcus could feel the weight of their neighbors' stares, those judgmental glances that spoke volumes without saying a word. "People just need time," Marcus would reassure Julia, though even he couldn't shake the unease that hung in the air. It was like walking on eggshells in their own home, trying to fit in where they clearly weren't wanted. And Emily, poor Emily, was caught in the middle of it all. The little girl who once loved making new friends now came home quieter, more withdrawn. "How was school today, sweetie?" Julia would ask, to which Emily would only shrug. There were no playdates, no friendly knocks on the door from kids down the street. The isolation weighed heavy on all of them. Even their new home, which should have been a fresh start, now felt more like a reminder of everything they had to battle against, just to be accepted. One particular afternoon, Julia stood by the window, watching as her neighbors exchanged glances and whispered amongst themselves. It was a harsh reminder that no matter how much they tried to blend in, they were different, and people made sure they knew it. "You ever feel like this place is a test?" Julia asked Marcus. He nodded, not needing to say more. The real test, though, was still waiting for them, and they had no idea how difficult it was going to be. It wasn't long before Emily started dropping hints that something wasn't right. Little comments here and there about Mr. Thompson's moodiness, or how he would snap at the kids when no one was watching. "He's kinda mean, Mom," Emily once said, almost in passing, as if she wasn't sure whether to be concerned. But those words hit Julia like a ton of bricks. She could feel her pulse quicken, her motherly instincts kicking into overdrive. Something was off, and now Emily was feeling it too. Julia wasn't about to let this slide. One morning, she made the decision. She would follow the bus. Nothing crazy, just a simple drive behind, enough to ease her mind. But as she watched Mr. Thompson take route after route, her anxiety only grew. There was something strange in the way he looked through the rearview mirror, something almost predatory. "He's watching them," Julia whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The pieces were starting to come together, and none of them were good. Back home that evening, Julia couldn't shake the images from her head. "Maybe he's just strict?" Marcus suggested, trying to play devil's advocate, but even he couldn't hide the concern in his voice. Julia wasn't convinced. She decided to talk to one of the neighbors, Rebecca, thinking maybe someone else had noticed. But instead of support, Julia was met with cold indifference and even some unsettling remarks. "You know, you people always think someone's out to get you," Rebecca had said. And just like that, Julia knew. The problem wasn't just Mr. Thompson. It was much bigger and a whole lot uglier. Julia's conversation with Rebecca was a wake-up call. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson. It was the entire community, a place that looked picture-perfect on the outside, but held dark, unspoken truths. After that unsettling talk, Julia started paying more attention, not just to Mr. Thompson, but to the way the other families interacted with her and her own. Cold stares, forced smiles, even whispers that stopped as soon as she walked by. "We're not just outsiders here," she thought. "We're targets." The kind of targets that no one wanted to admit were being aimed at. Julia's suspicion grew stronger every day. She noticed how Mr. Thompson acted differently around the white children compared to Emily and the other black kids on the bus. His tone changed, his patience wore thin quicker, and sometimes he didn't even acknowledge them. One day, she mentioned it to Marcus. "You think this whole neighborhood's in on it?" she asked, half joking but serious enough. "Feels like it," Marcus replied, shaking his head. It was becoming clear. This wasn't just a bad bus driver. The whole system seemed stacked against them, right down to the very street they lived on. But what could they do? Julia felt trapped, like she was battling not just one man, but an entire community that was happy to look the other way. And now, it wasn't just about keeping Emily safe. It was about standing up to a neighborhood that had shown its true colors. Julia knew one thing. Staying silent wasn't an option. There had to be a way to make them see, to make them care. But how? The answer wasn't obvious yet, but one thing was clear. This fight was only just beginning. It was a quiet evening when Emily finally opened up. Julia could tell something was wrong the moment her daughter walked through the door. Her usually bright eyes were dim, and there was an uneasiness in her steps. "Emily, what happened?" Julia asked gently, sitting her down at the kitchen table. For a moment, Emily didn't say anything, just fidgeted with her hands. Then the words came out all at once. Mr. Thompson had left her stranded at the far end of the neighborhood as punishment for not listening to him. He didn't shout, but his words were laced with venom, the kind of cruelness that no child should ever have to face. Julia's heart broke as she listened. She held Emily tight, reassuring her that none of this was her fault. But inside, a storm of anger was brewing. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Julia asked softly. Emily shrugged, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to make things worse." And there it was, the fear that had been sitting inside her daughter all along. Mr. Thompson had used his power to isolate her, to make her feel small, just because of the color of her skin. The racial prejudice was undeniable, and now it was personal. That night, Julia and Marcus sat together, trying to figure out their next move. "We can't let this slide," Marcus said, his voice firm. Julia nodded, still replaying Emily's confession in her head. They knew this wasn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore. It was about protecting their daughter and every other child who might be suffering in silence. The time for action had come, and they weren't going to back down. The next morning, Julia and Marcus wasted no time. They contacted the authorities, determined to make their voices heard. But, as they explained the situation, they were met with raised eyebrows and a concerning lack of urgency. "Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding?" one officer asked, as if Julia hadn't already replayed every detail 100 times in her mind. Julia could feel her frustration boiling over, but Marcus squeezed her hand, silently reminding her to stay calm. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Marcus said firmly. "This was targeted." And with that, the wheels of justice slowly began to turn. Days passed, and it felt like nothing was happening. But then, a breakthrough. Another Black family came forward, sharing a similar experience with Mr. Thompson. He'd singled out their child, too, with the same condescending tone and cruel punishments. Suddenly, the Carters weren't alone in their fight. Their voices, once dismissed as isolated incidents, became part of a larger, undeniable pattern. The system couldn't ignore them now. Julia and Marcus felt a spark of hope, even though they knew the road ahead would still be rough. Despite the slow response, the police finally took action. Mr. Thompson was arrested, his smug attitude replaced with a nervous expression as the gravity of his actions caught up with him. But Julia and Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Justice for Emily was only part of the battle. They needed to push for real change, to make sure no other child endured what their daughter had. The system, flawed as it was, had been cracked open. Now it was time to tear it down and rebuild it stronger. With Mr. Thompson arrested, you'd think the hard part was over, right? Not even close. Julia and Marcus knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. It wasn't enough to see one man face consequences. They needed to dismantle the system that allowed him to act this way in the first place. "This is bigger than just one bus driver," Marcus told Julia late one night. And he was right. They weren't just seeking justice for Emily. They were fighting for all the kids who had been victims of a system that let prejudice run unchecked. The Carters quickly got to work. They spoke at community meetings, shared their story with local media, and gathered support from other families. What started as a personal mission turned into a full-blown movement. Soon enough, the school district couldn't ignore them any longer. Under pressure from the public, they agreed to implement changes. Cameras would be installed on all school buses, and mandatory cultural sensitivity training was put in place for drivers and staff. "It's a start," Julia said, "but there's still so much work to do." Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Some parents grumbled about overreaction and political correctness, but Julia didn't care. She knew what they had achieved was important. The fight wasn't over, but at least now, they were making strides toward a safer, more inclusive environment for their children. And with that, Julia and Marcus knew one thing for sure. They'd never stop fighting for their daughter, no matter how hard the road ahead would be. Morale of the story. In the end, the Carter story is about more than just one family. It's about standing up when the world wants you to sit down. It's about recognizing that change doesn't happen overnight, but through persistence, courage, and a refusal to be silenced. Have you ever faced a moment where your instincts told you something wasn't right? What did you do? Comment below and share your thoughts. Let's get the conversation going. Also, don't forget to watch the next video for more insights and stories like this. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the content that could make all the difference in understanding the world around us.